Hello and welcome back to Drive Driver Driven. My name is Humble and we're back on the Zero project. Before we continue with the engine, I finally got my parts, the last of the parts that I needed from GBS, which is a complete header ready to go on for this motor in the car. And before we finish building the engine, while it's still light and unbuilt, I want to slap it in the chassis really quick and test fit the header and the rest of the exhaust and get it mocked up to verify everything works and fits correctly before building up the engine and making it a little harder to work with. So I'm going to put the trans and the engine back in the car really quick, test fit the header, and test fit the rest of the exhaust, which will allow me to mount the rear exhaust hanger. And if that all looks good, then everything can come back out and we can continue with the engine build process. All right, so there you have it. Got the engine, transmission in the car, got the header mocked in, got the rest of the exhaust mocked up that Kumo's demonstrating here. And lastly, on the back, you can see the rear exhaust hanger. I actually have to pull the seat back out and mark and drill a couple holes for that, but then everything will be set in place. This is going to be sort of what the final arrangement looks like. Now, basically, is everything was hinging on this header because the kind of build your own one that I was given, the angle wasn't the correct one. So if you look, the front of the engine, everything's kind of off by 10 degrees this way, and that's the way it sits in this chassis, and everything's offset. Even the oil pan is offset by this 10 degrees. Well, the header that I got originally was not an offset header, so it was actually hitting this top tube. And now you can see there's like a finger's width of daylight underneath there, which is what you need, otherwise it'll burn this paint. And I may even go the extra step to wrap this header up just to protect this area a little bit more, but otherwise this is the proper header. It's the 10-degree offset header. The exhaust lines up, collector, everything, the muffler. So the thing about these mufflers is you can see here that it's cat and muffler for the Duratec. So there's actually a cat inside this front section, and then the back half is muffler. Originally, I wanted to coat everything about the exhaust, get it ceramic coated black to match kind of everything else on the car, but the Ultima parts arrived at the port yesterday, so we don't have time for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get this going as it sits with the silver piping, and sometime down the road, I'll get the exhaust taken off, blasted and ceramic coated black to get the idea I had in my head going. All right, doesn't look like much from here, but got the exhaust hanger and everything finalized. So we have the manifold cinched up on the head, comes down to the muffler. This is all one piece here. down to the catback muffler. I showed you the hanger before. It's much easier to see now. So I had to drill a couple of holes on the bottom and one through the side to place this hanger accurately. And you can see it's just holding the muffler with this kind of cradle here, and then it has this spring clip that comes up and over and latches down, and that's it. That's pretty solid. That's not going to go anywhere. So super simple, nothing much to it. Easy job. But while we were here and we had everything set up, it just makes sense to get that out of the way, so when it comes to do final assembly, we don't need to figure all this out. So now is we're gonna undo all this, put the block back on the stand, and resume the engine build. All right, got everything out of the car. Got the engine back on the engine stand, or the block rather. Couple things that I wanted to show you guys. I didn't really highlight installing them, but we have ARP head studs and main studs installed in the block. Couple neat features I wanted to point out for just basically the stock Duratec engine that I thought were neat. If you look here, these passages down the side, and then those guys down in there, same over here, these are oil return passages from oil in the head, and rather than drip down directly on the crank, in order to help alleviate oil frothing and oil misting inside of the crankcase, much of the oil return actually comes down these ports and these vents down on the side of the block to keep oil return away from the rotating assembly. Also, sort of an old school hot rod trick, but in each of these main journals, there is actually a piston oil squirter that fires a jet of oil up into the bottom of each piston. Normally that's something you would see in boosted applications, even though this is an NA motor. Every little bit of piston cooling and lubrication helps. So just a neat little thing that you don't see a lot of in factory engines anymore. Even high performance ones, that's sort of an old school trick. Our next step on the engine assembly is we're going to start building up our bottom end, our short block. And so to do that, we're going to need to put the crank in and then drop in our pistons and rods. So let's get on that. All right, so we're back on the bench because now that we got the crank done, we have to assemble our pistons and rods. So let's get some of this stuff out of the way here. We have our rods, so I'm going to grab rod number 1 because we've marked these. We already have the bearings inside. All right, so we have our wrist pin circlips, our rod. What we want to make sure is that we have a nice, good fit here. That should move very easily. Depending on your application, sometimes you need to press fit the wrist pin to the rod itself. This is a slip fit for the Duratec. And so the easiest way to do this is we'll test fit in each, make sure that everything's good. We know that this fits in both our piston and our rod. It's all part of the package. What we want to do next is we actually want to install one of these circlips in one side of the piston first, and then we'll put the wrist pin and the rod together, and then the last circlip will go in to the completed assembly, and then it'll be ready to put in the motor. If you screw this up, it will shoot across the garage. Sometimes the easiest way is to start on one side and then walk the ring around. And it's always a good idea to just keep your finger on it to keep it from springing loose. There, just like that. It sounds a lot easier than it goes in, but you can see it's in the little track all the way around. This is why you'll see a lot of people that really don't like doing this, or you can have, well, it can lead to catastrophic failures if you don't get this clip inside of these grooves or not in there seated correctly. We just want to double check and make sure that it's in that little groove all the way around, and it is. So now we can put some oil in here, lube up our wrist pin, and then get the rest of the assembly together. This stuff is nothing special. The reason this oil is green is this is a Brad Penn regular dyno oil. It's not a synthetic, but it's a Brad Penn break-in oil. I just like to use it for initial engine assembly. And then we'll get this guy started. Then we're gonna get a little oil in there, and then everything slides home. Now this is the fun bit, is trying to get the last circlip into the piston while there's a little bit of oil all over everything. But you want to make sure that the wrist pin is fully seated in there. I'm going to try the same trick as before to get this guy seated in there. There, and if you hear that little click, that's a good sign that it's in its little home in there. So again, you see how that traps the wrist pin. Ditto for the other side. And what's nice about this is it's a floating design, so you can move everything back and forth. It moves freely. There's no binding, no nothing like that. So our first piston is ready. We're gonna go and do the rest of them. All right, so we've got all of our pistons and rods put together. All of our locks are in place. Everything's lubed up and ready to go. Before we can drop these in the engine, there's a couple things that we need to double check first. All right, so the first thing we need to do is our piston ring gaps. So you can see here on this guy, this is where our gap is. So if you look at the top of the piston, got some Kumo hair here, plenty of that in the build. You want to make sure this doesn't happen. It's kind of hard to see, but you don't want both of those gaps to line up like this. What that'll do is that'll allow an immense amount of blow-by. So every time the cylinder fires, a bunch of gases are just going to go straight through that gap and down into the block, and you'll have tons of blow-by. So ideally what you want to do is you want these gaps to be 180 degrees apart. So you want one on the left and you want the other one on the right side. And by doing that, you make sure that if the gas does get past this ring, it's got to go all the way around to the other side of the cylinder before it can get past the second ring. And really what's going to happen is that will happen, but there are channels for that gas to expand behind the ring and to force it outward more and get better sealing on the pistons. On the bottom, on your oil ring, same thing. You don't want the gaps to align. So like there's a gap there and there's a gap on the other side. And also you want to make sure that these gaps are different from the one on the first and second. So the way this is set up now is we have our top ring is the gap on this side. Our secondary ring has the gap on this side. And then our oil rings have a gap on the top and the bottom. And so our number one piston is all set and ready to be dropped into the motor. And I'll have to do this for all of the pistons so that once we do get to the motor, we can just compress the rings and then drop them in. The second thing that we have to do is we have to pull these rod bolts out and we have to measure them, because these rod bolts, they're ARP rod bolts and they're meant for a stretch spec. There's a couple different ways you can do this. If you don't have a bolt stretch gauge like this one, typically there is a torque spec that you'll follow. So it'll be like 25 foot-pounds plus 60 degrees or 30 foot-pounds plus 60 degrees. Or if you have a bolt stretch gauge like this guy, you measure the length of the bolt. In this case, the dial indicator's already zeroed out. So you measure the length of this bolt, and then when you tighten it, you can check it again, and if it's grown even just a little bit, it'll stretch as you torque it down, and you're looking for a certain amount of stretch in the bolt. And for these, I believe it's about 5 thousandths, so not very much. Once we get these measured, we can torque all the rods down to spec and then double check our spec with our rod bolt stretch gauge. So I'll go ahead and get the rest of the rings ready, and then we'll move on over to the block and we'll start dropping the pistons in. So we just need to torque those down, but our bottom end is just about ready. If I could just keep this wrench in my very slippery hand. All right, so I'll go ahead and get those torqued down. And then our main short block assembly is almost done.